Dave and Cliff love swiftwater canoeing so much that they even go out before the snow melts and the ice completely leaves the rivers. On this day, they parked one of their vehicles upstream at the point of departure and the other downstream at their expected destination. Dave and Cliff were experienced paddlers, but on this trip, they only took a limited number of items, including the basic minimal safety gear for a canoe. Knowing that the water was cold and there could possibly be a risk of dumping their boat, they made sure to wear wetsuits under their clothing and paddling booties, which they knew they would need to decrease heat loss if they ended up in the water. They also took along a dry sack with a tarp and minimal extra clothing to change into in the event of an upset, knowing that they would only have a couple of hours at most before they made it to their car, where they had towels, warm sweaters, and extra shoes to change into. It was a beautiful sunny day, and the cold water was moving fast. The paddlers were having a great time shooting the rapids. They were dry, warm, and happy. Then, not totally unexpected, Cliff and Dave hit some real tricky water and dumped their canoe. Having done this before on previous trips, this was not a big deal for these paddlers. They calmly floated feet first down the rapids, staying close to one another in their canoe with a plan to regroup in the calm pool a little further downstream. Then, their worst nightmare came true. Their canoe hit a rock broadside. Unable to unwrap their canoe from the rock and knowing they could not possibly swim to their destination, they took what little supplies they had and swam to shore. Once the pair were safely out of the water, they took stock of their situation. Cliff and Dave did take a cell phone with them that day, but they were unable to find service in the area that they were in. And unfortunately, the paddlers failed to file a trip plan, indicating information such as where they were going, what they were wearing, the gear they had with them, and when they expected to return, and then left it with a responsible individual who would be able to alert search and rescue as soon as they were overdue. Dave and Cliff thought it was best to stay close to the spot they exited the river in hopes that someone would find them faster rather than aimlessly trying to find a nearby road. It wasn't until later that day that search and rescue were alerted by a friend who noticed they had not returned home from their paddle. The search team started their search for the missing paddlers early that morning. They were able to locate one of the paddlers' vehicles, set up their command post, and began their search upstream. Although Dave and Cliff were able to build a temporary shelter to keep them out of the wind and protect them from any falling snow, they weren't prepared with anything else they may need for an overnight stay in the cold. After being exposed to the elements overnight in the cold, wet conditions, the pair were found by search and rescue the next day. Although the paddlers were not yet clinically hypothermic, they were both very cold, and one of them fell victim to a non-freezing cold injury. Despite search and rescue's successful evacuation of the pair to safety, Cliff was left with permanent foot pain and increased cold sensitivity for years after the incident. But it should have been different. Both Cliff and Dave should have been found safe and warm. Here's how. Dave and Cliff, both experienced paddlers, decided to only bring minimal gear with them on their short jaunt down the river. Although their outing was only supposed to take a few hours and precautions were taken for a potential capsize during the paddle, they didn't think about what they would do if they were injured or their canoe was damaged and they would have to survive long enough for help to arrive. In addition to the required safety equipment for a canoe, paddlers should always carry extra clothing, especially warm socks and extra shoes, a lighter or flint match to start a fire, a tarp and some rope to build a shelter, a tool such as a small saw or axe to cut both wood for fire and tree boughs to help insulate them from the ground. Extra water and snacks are also a good idea. By putting these items in a dry sack, it would help keep them dry and contained in one place. Before embarking, Dave and Cliff should have asked themselves, do we have the right equipment and the proper knowledge to survive a night out in this environment? Although the paddlers did bring a small tarp and minimal extra clothing with them, they did not have the ability or means to warm up. Instead, they remained wet, and without a way to fully dry their clothes or their thin, wet paddling booties, they began to get colder and colder. Had Dave and Cliff considered bringing the tools necessary to help them survive, they would have had the means to dry their wet clothing and also warm up their cold, wet feet. Their decision to stay in one spot near the river was a smart one. However, had they filed a trip plan and left it with a responsible person, the pair wouldn't have lengthened their exposure outside in the cold before being found. With a little preparation, knowledge, and the equipment needed to stay out overnight, Dave and Cliff would have been found by search and rescue safe and warm.